Welcome, everybody. Today, my guest is Logan Nye. Logan is a physician and computer scientist who builds AI for patient care. Logan is also the founder of Galen Health, a digital health startup that tackles early detection of pancreatic cancer. Galen Health is pioneering a healthcare revolution, solving disease from first principles. Galen's flagship product, OncoSight, harnesses advanced artificial intelligence for early cancer detection and treatment with a primary focus on pancreatic cancer. And Logan is also currently pursuing a master's degree at Carnegie Mellon in computer science. Thank you so much, Logan, for being here with us today. It's really a pleasure, and we look forward to a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Cool. And Logan, can you tell us a little bit about your background? What led you to become a researcher in AI and pancreatic cancer? And what has your trajectory looked like so far?
Yeah, it's a bit of a unique one. Nobody really had AI on the mind about 5, 10 years ago, so it's not something that you plan on. But I guess to tell that story, I should start with my medical background. So I knew from an early age that I wanted to be a physician, and I went to medical school planning to become an orthopedic surgeon. During that time, it was a competitive match cycle. It was during the COVID years, and at the end of medical school, for those that don't know, you have to apply to a match process to see where you get placement for training. I applied for orthopedic surgery training residency, and I actually didn't match anywhere. And so I was first introduced into AI, getting really hands-on experience with it the year following medical school when I was doing a research year, preparing to reapply to orthopedic surgery residencies. And my research year was at Harvard Medical School doing building computer vision models for fracture detection and different tests in the orthopedic surgery field. So during that year, I got a lot of hands-on experience with AI, and I kind of began to understand that it's really a tool that can be used for a lot of good. And so I decided that maybe instead of doing clinical care, I wanted to apply my medical knowledge through AI so I could build things that could help people at scale. So I decided that I'm going to forego the traditional physician training route and instead combine it with computer science and AI and try to build technologies that can help people all over the world.
Oh, that's a beautiful story. Now, imagine a big shift. And were you a little bit heartbroken when you didn't get placed as you expected, or was that?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's medical training in the U.S. is a long path. So if you decide that you want to go to medical school, it's 4 years of undergraduate or like university, and then that's a pre-medical degree, and then you have to go to medical school for another 4 years, and then you graduate, and then from there you go through residency training, which is anywhere between 3 to 7 years. So you have to know from fairly early on that you want to be a physician. So graduating medical school is the culmination of plans that you've had for well over a decade, and that was the case for me. So if you don't get matched, if you don't match into a residency right out of the gate, it's usually pretty heartbreaking for people. So I was disappointed, but I was.
How common is that not to get matched right off the gate? Just curious. Do you know?
It's becoming more common, but it's more the exception than the rule. So I think it's like anywhere between 1 to 5% of medical school graduates don't match during each cycle, and so there's one cycle per year. It's done in the spring every year, and on a day called Match Day.
Wow.
And
And is
yeah,
that
depending on
algorithmic?
it is, yeah, it's actually the name of the. I learned since coming to Carnegie Mellon that the name of the algorithm they use for this is called the stable wedding algorithm. So it basically takes all the people that are applying to residency and all the residencies, and it takes their preferences into account and then tries to match them together. And it's actually done very efficiently from a mathematical standpoint, but it still has imperfections. It's not an idealized situation, but I think it's the best that they can make of it with what they have available right now.
Just curious. I mean, and I think this is a segue to a few of the more sophisticated questions I have. But when you talk about this like matchmaking, you're talking about this intersection of the mathematical world with the relational world, right? Typically,
Yeah,
we'll match each other like based on personal preferences, opinions, feelings. But then when you put a mathematical model on it, then it's different, right? In your opinion, is it just a matter of time until mathematical models can accurately contemplate these relational things? Or do you think they're always going to be fundamentally different, like any mathematical modeling versus how people truly relate to one another?
Are you talking about in the match process, like the
Yeah.
match algorithm?
Hmm.
If it were to go that way, I think it's possible for it to take more of those considerations into the equation. But right now, the way that it's built, there's not really any room for that sort of stuff. It's just a very cut and dried rank your favorite your preferences of where you'd like to train as an applicant from one through however many places you interview at, and then they do the same thing on the training site side, and then it's just trying to optimize those top choices between the two across
Sure.
the entire populace.
And I imagine at some point, for instance, they could use large language models and other kinds of
Yeah.
um, engines with greater inferential capabilities. But I guess the question I'm asking is, I get maybe a little bit more philosophical, which is,
Hmm.
in your opinion, like I think a lot about, for instance, the people in my life. Like I think a lot about my spouse. I think a lot about my friends, and I notice how a lot of people meet their loved ones, for instance, through matchmaking devices,
Hmm.
algorithmic matchmaking devices, and sometimes that's a blessing. I mean, they wouldn't have met those people maybe otherwise. Sometimes they're matched with people who are not necessarily the people who they could have been matched in a more natural process. And I guess the question I have is, just based on your beliefs, do you think it's just a matter of tech catching up to this more soft matchmaking that humans do? Or do you think there's something that's fundamentally different about how humans think and about how humans match each other to things?
That's a good question. I think I think that in time, machine intelligence will get closer and closer to those soft skills, those soft abilities. It's going to get better over time. But from a fundamental aspect, I don't know if it's exactly the same. I think that's where you start delving into deeper questions about consciousness and what it means to be human, and that is above my pay level right now. But
Above
but
mine
it,
too.
I mean, that's that sort of stuff. It's going to become, especially with language models and anything that's natural language processing, it's going to become more natural, quote unquote, over time, and it's going to seem more human and more tailored to the specifics of individuals.
And when you talk about what Galen Health does as far as pioneering on first principles, what are first principles?
First principles, thinking about what is, it's almost like in the physics sense. What is disease? How do we rethink how we're tackling it right now, and what is the most strategic way to go about solving diseases? So right now, healthcare is steeped in dogma. There's a lot of processes that are broken and perpetuated simply because we don't have any better alternatives right now. First principles thinking is this idea of approaching problems from the very beginning. You wipe the entire whiteboard and you say, okay, let's rethink this completely. Just because we've been working through health insurance claims, or we've been administering chemotherapies for cancer, or fill in the blank approach that's common nowadays. Just because we've been doing that doesn't mean that's the best answer. Let's go back to the very fundamentals and think about what is the problem at hand. What is cancer? And from that, how could we more effectively and more efficiently treat it? And that's kind of like what we're setting out to do. Right now, for us, that means detecting it as early as possible, and from there, um, trying to mitigate a lot of the downstream effects and downstream costs that are associated with cancer. But over time, it's going to gradually mean going down and thinking about what it really causes cancer. What is cancer as a process? How do we mitigate that process or preempt it altogether? And solving disease from that sort of different angle.
So, if I understood correctly, a first principles approach is about scraping off all existing ideology and trying to look at it from, let's say, a more of trying to look at it as much as possible for what it is, as opposed to what we've made it to be because of all of these contexts and filters that we end up using over time. Is that a fair kind of?
Right. Yeah, it's kind of trying to strip away any existing biases that you have just because of your your past or what's been told to you before, and thinking individually about the problem at hand, trying to think about what the best strategy is.
And what have you learned so far in adopting this first principles approach in your study? of cancer compared to common medical beliefs and practices? What has surprised you so far?
Well, our approach is kind of informed by first principles. Lots of new chemotherapeutics or cancer therapies nowadays that are developed are kind of at the tail end of the cancer life cycle. They're new pharmaceuticals or they're new imaging techniques, things that happen long after the cancer is diagnosed, and they might have some incremental difference in a patient's outcomes. Like for pancreatic cancer, for example, it's a particularly fatal disease, and a new chemotherapy that comes out might prolong someone's life on average by a few weeks. Is that really that big of a difference? So for us, thinking from first principles was doing away with all this idea of developing new pharmaceuticals or new expensive interventions, and thinking about how do we stop the process before it even happens, and sort of getting at the very root of the problem. And for us, it's at the very beginning of the disease.
And what is the very beginning of the disease in your opinion?
We're still trying to figure out the patterns, but there are ways to detect that someone is considered high risk for pancreatic cancer early on. Right now, we don't have a way to catch or diagnose diseases or diagnose pancreatic cancer until it's relatively late stage, like stage 3 or stage 4.
Oh
And
wow.
typically at that point, it's too late to do anything really significant. The disease is already spread, and patients have no choice but to get a systemic treatment like chemotherapy or radiation treatments. But if we can catch it early on, then by definition, when it's only in stage 1 or stage 2, it's still localized to the pancreas itself. So you can get a surgical procedure and remove the cancerous part of the organ, and then that's, in theory, is cured. So that's what we're trying to do.
And how does AI play a part in being able to perform these early detections?
AI is able to mine data that is in the electronic health record. That is what we're trying to do right now. The electronic health record is a treasure trove of different data points, all sorts of signal that you can analyze to try to find predictive patterns. But for pancreatic cancer, we've never really had a way to screen patients or to catch that early. For breast cancer, you have mammograms that you start going to get at a regular interval once you pass a certain age. I think now it's 40. For colon cancer, you get colonoscopies. There's nothing really for abdominal cancers, and that's particularly true for pancreatic cancer because of where it sits in your abdomen. And so there's no real way for it to manifest itself until it's at a point where it starts spreading, and that's when patients start showing symptoms. But by using this information that's in the electronic health record and mining lots of data retrospectively, we can find the trends across time that sort of predict that somebody or that suggest that somebody is considered high risk for developing a cancer in the near future, and then watch them more carefully. AI, that's where AI comes in, is able to uncover these predictive patterns that are far too complex and nuanced for us to find just looking at the data.
That's amazing, and it seems relatively straightforward to me that AI would be able to cross-reference troves of data and information that a human mind, at least mine, wouldn't even be able to come close to being able to crunch. But in your experience, in your community, are there it seems like, for me, it seems very clear cut that it's a tool and not something that would be, let's say, not helpful. But are in your opinion, are there doctors who also have a different kind of point of view and who aren't such a big fan of using AI in these
Oh
detection
yeah.
processes? And what's their what's in like typically what would be their claims or arguments against this?
So typically, the claims for our particular use case, the kind of early risk screening and stratification, is one: is it accurate? If someone's flagged as like a high risk patient, and then you bring them in for a clinical follow up, let's say that they don't have pancreatic cancer, right? They're not at risk. They still have been told that they're considered high risk, and so there's a lot of emotional weight that goes with that. So it's something you have to be very wary of. And then also the explainability. So if they can't figure out why a certain patient was marked as high risk, some people are really afraid to treat it. Medicine is very calculated, very incremental in the way that it makes changes, and so trusting a machine algorithm is a radical divergence from the way that things have been done historically. So it takes a forward thinking and sort of innovative physician to embrace it wholly. I'd say it's pretty divided right now as far as like the clinical practitioners. Some people are ready to embrace it and see it as like another data point that they can work with for doing their job, and other people want nothing to do with it. So it's just a matter of it's on an individual basis from my experience.
So, in your opinion, it's still, when you boil it down, there's still some people who treat it as good, helpful, and other people who treat it as bad, harmful, or like the. I mean, it still gets ideal in some way or form, gets captured by ideology, right? It's like not
Yes.
seen for what it is, from a first principles perspective. Like, yeah, could be helpful if you use it a certain way, but could also not be helpful if you don't use it that certain way. And I'm just drawing here a parallel because I don't know if you agree, but I think, with any technology, but particularly I notice this a lot with AI. It's exactly as you described. When you go into the details of it, you notice that it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it could be very helpful in certain contexts, and it could not be helpful in other contexts. And it goes down to exactly how you described it. Even the way how this information is managed, how it's described to patients. It's one thing for a patient, let's say, to get a report saying, in really large bold letters saying you are high risk of, pancreatic cancer. It's the other thing to have a doctor saying, hey, maybe you should come back here for another follow-up appointment because I want to check something here that got flagged in your report. Nothing big, nothing to worry. Just want to make sure that we're on the right spot. It's the same information communicated in a completely different way is going to create a very different form of like emotional outcome in a patient, right? Or do you
Yeah.
think I'm wrong?
No, I agree with that wholeheartedly. So that's a pattern that you see with any sort of new technology. Technologies are tools, right? And with any powerful tool, it can be used for good or for bad. If I give me a hammer, like in the literal tool sense, I can build a house or I can harm someone. The same is the case with AI. It's been the case with the internet, for example. There was a lot of fraud and identity theft that happened when the internet first came to be. But I would argue that it's the most impactful invention of the 20th century. It's revolutionized the world for net positive. AI is the same way. It can do a lot of harm if used for malintent, but on the whole, it's going to really lift the floor, so to speak. It's going to uplift everybody around the world and empower people.
And in your opinion, Logan, like from what I understood, I mean, you've always had this calling to be a physician and to help people, heal people. It seems that this made the adoption of AI perhaps something a little bit more natural, or like a natural segue in your career path. Um, do you think that like some people end up missing the end goal or intent of their profession? I'm not just talking about doctors necessarily, but in general, it just feels like the more you're mission oriented, the easier it becomes to adapt and evolve and change around these different possibilities around you, as opposed to just following kind of like a more railroaded path. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's natural to have some apprehension at first. It involves change. Adapting is change, and change is uncomfortable. And a lot of people would much rather do without having to adapt to a new paradigm, a new technology, and figure out how to use it. It's much easier to just keep doing things the way that they've always been done. But if you see it as a tool for, like you're saying, if you're mission oriented, if you see it as a powerful tool to help accomplish your mission, then you have no problem, and you're willing to put in the extra hours to understand the technology and figure out how you can use it for better. Yeah, that was the case for me. There was As a surgeon, I could see myself helping people individually in the operating room one at a time. But through AI and the miraculous ability that code has to scale infinitely, I can build something that will help people all over the world and multiple people simultaneously. And so I'm able to magnify my impact for net good as a physician who learns how to use AI. And that kind of convinced me to jump into it with both feet.
That's super interesting. Do you think, in your opinion, do you think there have you met doctors who fear being replaced by AI, or is that not a concern?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are some specialties where it feels more that way than others. For example, if your medical specialty is something where you're just doing decision making and you don't do any sort of like procedures where you have hands-on treatment with the patient, a lot of that decision making is algorithmic in nature. It's like, do we do this or do we do that? And then you move on further down the reasoning chain, and so that can be automated. And so I've seen some apprehension at that level, but I think once you dive into it, you realize that it's a tool for augmenting physicians and not replacing them. It's a
And yeah, the reason why I'm asking this is that sometimes I talk to lawyers, sometimes I talk to translators, sometimes I talk to engineers, and there's something there's a common theme that I notice is that when I notice when I talk to translators thinking about lawyers and engineers, for instance, and doctors as an example, they will typically think of those trades as more complex than their own trades, and they will typically think about, oh, they don't those trades don't run necessarily a risk of being replaced. My trade runs a risk of being replaced. And then I'll talk to a lawyer, and then they'll have an opposite feeling. It's like, oh, I'm at risk because my job, I just typed this, I just asked GPT to run a contract for me, and it did a great job at that. And anyway, there's a lot of I think there's a lot of sometimes, and I agree with you, like in certain more algorithmic trades or algorithmic situations, like the replaceability factor gets bigger. But I guess the key thing that I'd like your thoughts on is that I, one analogy, and I mean, I resonate a lot with your words. So I really believe that the AI is a tool, and in the end, it's about humans making good use of that tool and understanding the nuances and when it's good, when it's not good, and how to use it. And I love the hammer example; it's something that I use a lot. But when I talk to translators, I notice that a lot of them adopt a very fearful response. And the response is, this cannot be as good as me. So they immediately put themselves in a situation where they want to compare themselves against the tool. And it's almost ludicrous when you compare it with the hammer, right? It's like saying, yeah, the hammer cannot be as good as me. Yeah, the hammer will not be as good as you. Maybe it'll pound a nail better than you, but it's not going to be, you can't compare yourself to a tool. But anyway, I see a lot of translators going down that route. I've seen lawyers go down that route. And I wonder, do you think, like, is there a shift that you think people go through, or do you think there's any advice you can give as far as what people can do to look at these things more as aids and less as competition, or is that just human nature?
that's a good question. The way I mean, I'm not a translator, so I put myself in their shoes. But I would encourage them to, as much as they can, take the same approach that convinced me to look into it. It's less about replacing and more about augmenting. So think about why you love being a translator, what how you derive joy from it, and what your job is as a translator. And then once you study a little bit about AI, think about how can I use this to amplify my impact or the difference that I make in the world. Because that's really what it is. It takes the more monotonous and repetitive tasks or aspects of our job and automates it so that we can be much more effective and have a much greater impact in the world. And if you derive joy from being a translator, if you learn how to use AI, you'll magnify your impact in the world.
I love that. I mean, I resonate with that as well, and that's something I picked up very from your very first statement. I mean, the fact that you're so mission driven, I think that really gives you a lot more flexibility as far as what you incorporate or not, because it's not about, let's say, being following a certain thing, but actually reaching a certain goal, and then that makes you less prescriptive and more open to embracing different things, and I love that. I think one of the things is that, again, when you think about like the overall impact and that people have, certain professions like doctors, I think definitely um, have a correlation with people having a calling for that, right? It's a very complex profession. There's many years of training involved. It's not easy. You have to go through dozens of different tests and acceptances, and it's a very complex process, right? And it naturally weeds out anybody that doesn't have a very strong vocation for that. Other professions are maybe a little bit simpler to get into comparatively. But in your opinion, what makes it possible for people to follow this deeper vocation or calling in life, and how did you get in touch with yours, and how do you recommend people to get in touch with theirs?
Well, it takes a lot of reflection. So my calling in life, what gives me a sense of purpose in the world, is to be an instrument of good. That's why I went into medicine. I chose to go into medicine because it was the best means by which to accomplish that mission. We're talking about missions and being flexible in the details, and that allows you to adapt. My mission has always been to be an instrument of good, and so I plan to do that through medicine. But if that might be because I was exposed to medicine early on. If I was born into a place and situation where I didn't know what a doctor was, but I learned about engineering or science like physics or something like that early on, maybe I would have been a physicist instead. Who knows? But for me, the reason why I chose to go into medicine, the reason why I feel so purpose driven in what I do, is because I took the time to reflect on what kind of work do I want to do in the world? Where do I derive joy and purpose and meaning? And what sorts of careers will allow me to scratch that itch, so to speak, will allow me to fulfill that desire. And then from there, you can be sort of flexible in the details. Like I said, I was planning to be a surgeon. That's how I plan to be an agent of good in the world, a source of good. But now I'm going to be building AI. Typing on a keyboard and writing code is much different than using a scalpel and making incisions. But they're both sort of geared towards the same end of trying to use medical knowledge to improve the lives of other people around the world.
And do you have already some success stories around the ability of Galen Health to be able to flag some of these early symptoms? And are you already, at what stage are you as far as like the development of that solution?
We are still fairly early on. Healthcare is a long process. It takes a long time to get through all the red tape and administrative barriers to getting into an actual healthcare system and deploying your product. So we do have a functional version of the product, but it uses a small data set, and it's not the greatest thing in the world. We'll need to improve over time. But we have a functional MVP, and we are working with healthcare centers around the United States right now to try to co-develop and improve this technology. Right now, we're working mostly with cancer centers. Carnegie Mellon, where we're based out of, is in Pittsburgh. So, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center is our big collaborator right now, and we are working with other comprehensive cancer centers around the country to sort of get the gears moving for clinical trial planning and pilot studies. So that's about where we're at right now. We have the core technology down. Now we're just waiting to get into the healthcare system to actually deploy and start doing these studies.
How many years do you think you still have before you start to begin to perform these studies and actually see for yourself where it works?
Well, hopefully by next year we'll have some of these studies hammered out. We're supposed to start getting into healthcare systems as early as this summer because this is something that we've been working on for a few months now. But that's to be determined. We're hoping that we can have some results as of next year.
And then after that, assuming your results are good, how long is the track until you actually have your solution rolled out for clinics all over the country? How does that work?
That's going to be more like 4 years at this point. So we'll run the order of events that we're foreseeing right now is work with these cancer centers to co-develop the technology, and that'll take a chunk of time. And then once you co-develop this technology, you can run internal studies on it and publish those results. That'll take some time. Then the bridge to like widespread adoption will be paid pilot studies by these early adopters. You'll find healthcare networks where you're able to save them a lot of money through your technology or some sort of benefit that incentivizes them to want to try it. And once they get on board, then it sort of starts this flywheel process where you ramp up and up and up.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, 4 years feels like a long time when you have an idea that you really want to get out. But I admire the tenacity because it's definitely a requirement for going down a venture like that. And I'm curious in your mind, Logan, when you think about the potential of cross referencing all of this data, do you think it's utopian to be in a world, for instance, where maybe based on a genetic analysis, when you're first born, you're able to derive the probability of developing, for instance, pancreatic cancer? Or do you think it's just about like finding flags later on? And I guess my question is more, again, more abstract. How deep do you think, in just potentially, could you cross-reference data, and how early could you detect some of these things?
So this is where that solving from first principles comes back to play. From a theoretical standpoint, that's definitely possible. But the only tweak you'd have to make is it has to be dynamic. If somebody is born with a bunch of genetic alterations or mutations that predispose them to a certain cancer, you can know that at birth, but nobody's going to develop lung cancer at age 6 months. So it's something that has to be updated dynamically throughout time. But as far as cross-referencing and monitoring and having these dynamic risk predictions, yeah, you could have, in theory, a perfect digital twin that calculates all these discrepancies and informs you of it in real time. The limit there is going to be compute. It's just very energy intense right now to do so, but as the cost of compute comes down, as we make the cost of energy come down, that'll become more and more feasible at a more and more granular level. So theoretically, yes. Practically, there's constraints like energy and computational resources, but yeah.
And I have one question here that I'm going to apologize in advance because it's going to be a rabbit hole of maybe quantum mechanics, but I think it's an interesting question to me. But which is, let's say I do have this digital twin created, and I'm able to look at myself at age 15, and I'm able to tell, well, at age 15 I have a 67% chance of developing pancreatic cancer, or whatever probability of developing this or that. And I think, yeah, there's the possibility that maybe I'll take the right preventative actions of, and I'll lower that percentage. And at age 20, my 67% chance will drop to 34% chance, and so on. And maybe I'll be able to manage those numbers. But then the flip point of that is that maybe another version of myself is living in a place where I've never seen those results. And maybe I wouldn't have taken those preventative actions, but maybe I would have taken other actions that maybe would have actually maybe even helped me even more because I wasn't even aware of those possibilities. So I guess my deeper question is, how much do you think the awareness, the very early awareness of potential future outcomes, how much does that change the way we live our lives, like our destinies? And do you think that there's like a threshold where we shouldn't go through?
As far as thresholds, I don't know if I have an answer for that, but I suspect that would vary from person to person. But this is a dilemma that's found in medicine today too. You don't have to consent to knowing all that information. Just because it's possible to calculate those sort of like risk profiles, or these theoretical percentages of your risk for developing a certain cancer. If you feel that it's something that you'd rather not know, you don't have to consent to that. Like me personally, I don't know if I would want to know all the time like what my risk of certain cancers are, because I would foresee it definitely impacting my mental health over time and my decision making. So that is really interesting ethical dilemma. But I would expect that, sort of like in healthcare today, if you say I'd rather not know, or I'd rather not receive that treatment, or that's not something that I want to know about, you don't have to know about it. They can withhold that information.
It's interesting though. It's because even if you don't consent to knowing and you withhold that information, you're still consciously withholding that information. It's still fundamentally different, in my opinion, from not being able to know. If you're not able to know, it's not a decision. If you've made that decision, not that it's necessarily better or worse, but now it's a decision. And I just wonder a lot about how technology that can be so clairvoyant can change the way that we live our lives, for better and for worse. But I think that in that respect, because in theory you would be able to cross-reference such crazy amounts of information, how much knowing, and this would extend maybe even well beyond medicine, how much knowing our future would make us, would change our trajectory in ways that maybe we wouldn't want them to be changed. But I just think that's a fascinating idea. And as far as like this cross referencing of different data points and data modeling goes, in your opinion, based in, I don't even know, I guess my first question, the deeper question, which is, when you talk about these data models that are able to predict, for instance, pancreatic cancer, do you have to define the parameters yourself or your team, or can you create a model that defines these parameters dynamically and, like, for instance, looks for things that you wouldn't even be able to imagine? Or how does that work?
Right now we're doing it by hand, but that is the direction that we want to go, because one of the uses of AI is it's able to pick up on patterns that you weren't suspecting. Maybe there's some sort of geographically driven risk predictor that goes into the mix. We might not think about doing that, or we might mistakenly assume that that's part of it. But AI will know statistically what the right answer is. So we're hoping that this data mining capability of AI is going to help us find those variables of interest.
So if I understand correctly, maybe you're going to start with things that are more genetic or more about other symptoms or other diseases that people have more restricted, perhaps to provenly medical drivers, and then that could expand into AI being able to detect that people who live in colder climates with certain level of humidity have a greater probability of developing for X and Y factor, or people in certain diets and certain things. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a handful of known risk factors like genetic mutations and lifestyle factors, like, for example, smoking or being diabetic, having a BMI over 30, being clinically obese. These different factors have been shown to have correlations. So we can start with those by handcrafting those features, but over time, AI can start implementing more and more of that sort of hidden aspect of it.
I don't know if this is something that you think a lot about, but one of the things that I look at is, it seems in many ways, it seems like we live in a post-truth world, in the sense that, like, when I grew up, certain things were clearly bad, other things were clearly good, even from a medical perspective. Like, maybe saturated fats were bad, and maybe, yeah, certain things were labeled as bad. Smoking, by the time I was growing up, maybe by the time I was 5 or 6, was categorically bad. Certain and other things were categorically good. A lot of things, like, deviate in the middle, right? I've seen studies that show that, for instance, eggs are really good. I've seen studies that shows that eggs are really bad. Studies that show that egg whites are really good, but egg yolks are really bad, and vice versa. And I don't know if you agree, but there's a limit of what we can prove through data, because there's a limit of how many studies we can pull. And all of these studies, they have all of these different constraint factors that are hard to cross correlate and things like that. In theory, with AI, we would be able to establish, I guess my question, before I say that, my question to you is, do you think it's possible that we're able to move on to a greater idea of truth, or individualized truth, as is, at least, as opposed to healthy versus unhealthy practices through AI? Or do you think that's going to make things even murkier and more complicated?
As far as redefining what is truth from a philosophical standpoint, I don't know if we could go that far, but making it more nuanced and tailoring it to the individual, certainly. I mean, even with so you were talking about smoking, how it's categorically bad. Um, I would agree. And then in medical school, I learned that there's some diseases like ulcerative colitis or these GI diseases where smoking is actually a protective factor against it. And so, like, they talk about it in a positive light for the first time. So there's all these different nuances that you have to take into consideration. It's much easier to think in binary, good versus bad, for entire categories of people, but in reality, we're all individuals. So there's going to be individual considerations that need to be taken into account.
Yeah, I wonder if we could be in a world where, like, it says, I know that egg yolks are bad for me, but for you, eating 3 egg yolks is good, and so on. And I wonder if that's, I mean, I think, and I wasn't even thinking about, like, this idea of, like, more philosophical truth, but I wonder, in a world where health where health considerations were more subtle and nuanced and individualized, for instance, I would imagine that would have reverberations over other things as well. Because if we're not talking anymore about a society whether wine is good or bad, but wine is maybe really bad for me, but really great for you, up to 2 glasses a day, or certain things, I think that would bring about a much greater awareness of the fact that we're all somewhat different, somewhat, we don't have to think all the same. And I think maybe that could be the precursor of having more. more detailed conversations around these things. And instead of, having, let's say, a post on wine is bad and then having thousands of comments of people, yelling and screaming about how wine is good, and have that become, this really divisive debate. Maybe the question is, well, I would love to know from you, is wine good or bad for you, and how much? And, um, what are your thoughts on that? Like, on like this individualization of analysis of data and health? How do you see this playing out as far as both the medical field and as far as society in general?
I certainly hope it goes that way. As far as the comment sections, that's a matter of cultural adoption. That'll take a longer time than the actual technical capability to tailor or to individualize medicine and other lifestyle choices. But I agree. I think that that's a healthier way to go. I think a lot of the world is run on heuristics and oversimplification and these kind of binary good bad polarizing opinions, and there needs to be a little bit more room for nuance. I think you're right. It should change from person to person, and we should be a little more accepting of that. But I certainly hope it goes that way. I mean, there's an entire budding field called precision medicine that sort of goes down this path in the healthcare field, where the whole point being is every diagnosis, every treatment that you have, every intervention, so on, is tailored just to you, not clinical guidelines of everybody else in your country or whatever, but you, based on your genetic profile, based on your lifestyle choices, everything like that. So I think it is an ideal that we're trying to chase and will eventually become a reality.
Now, I imagine there are probably economic constraints around precision medicine, for instance. As interesting as it may be, it's probably a lot more expensive than traditional medicine. Am I right? Or
As of today, yes, it comes back to that the theory versus practicality thing, where there are resources that go into computing. Like it's very energy intensive, and the energy costs money, and so that is it's still expensive to do today, but hopefully becomes more affordable as innovations come in other fields as well, like energy efficiency, green energy, algorithmic discoveries, finding more efficient ways to compute the same outcomes, and just like chip and processor design. Hopefully the price comes down and we are able to have that a little more affordably.
and curious again, just exploring on this difference between behavioral patterns and available tech. But in your opinion, if we live in a world where, let's say, we arrive at like amazing predictable engines that are able to flag cancer, for instance, at a very very early stage, where 90% or more of the cancers are remediated before they evolve into any further stages, do you think that level of tech will make people in general more complacent about how they deal with their health, because ultimately they know that there's some kind of tech that's going to get detect it and cure it for them? Or do you think that there's also the possibility that the awareness of that detection is going to make people more aware and take more control over their own lives?
It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I think that knowledge will definitely change how people choose to live their lives, but as to how it changes, I'm not sure. That probably will vary on a person to person basis. But like for example, I can easily see people sort of relying on that as a fallback, as their like bailout, so they can just make whatever terrible decisions they want, and then just rely on an algorithm to let them know if they need to change something at the last minute. Hopefully, it doesn't go to that point, but I do foresee that being an impact for some people, and some people might feel empowered by it. Some people might feel empowered by the fact that they're retiring. They're 60 years old, they're retiring, and according to their health metrics and what they know about their status of how they live their life so far, they have several decades left. So what do they want to do with that? How do they want to spend their years? And like conversely, if somebody knows that they're more likely to pass at an earlier age, well, do I really want to be sitting in this 9 to 5 job right now, or do I want to move on to something else in my life? It could be empowering that way and taking control of your life. So it could be used either way, I think.
Yeah, we keep returning to the tool motif, right? It's so much about what we do with it versus what it is or what it isn't. So I really resonate with that. And in your opinion, Logan, have you seen so far any applications of AI that catch your eye as something that's just not good, something that you would not approve of? Are there any particular aspects that you don't avow?
Oh, I mean, going back to the tool motif, right? It's a very powerful tool. Now it's up to us to choose whether to use it for good or bad. I mean, the same technology that would lead to new medicines, for example, is the exact same approach that you'd use for creating new bioweapons, right? You're creating biological molecules with preferred characteristics. You could use the same approach to do either one. You can find that in any sort of field. You can make content creation very easy and sort of automate that and make it much more accessible to people. Or you could also enable deep fakes that are spreading misinformation and trying to sway the opinions of the population. So there's all sorts of
But those are things
bad
that are, I think,
applications.
more clearly like harmful use of tech, like using deep fakes or like bioweapons. Those are like categorically bad. But what about uses where people claim that they're good things, but that you don't necessarily agree that that's going to lead to a good outcome? If you can think of any, if you don't have
Yeah,
any
I
in
don't
mind.
know if I have any that would be controversial off the top of my head or would be considered controversial. Yeah, I don't know. Nothing comes to mind at the moment. Maybe if something pops up, I'll
In
share it
in
with you.
your opinion, if we live in a world where, let's say, most matchmaking between humans and jobs and humans and other humans gets made algorithmically via AI, do you think that's ethically reasonable, or would you have a problem with that?
I think it could be ethically reasonable if you do it the right way. So if you start going about things like that are unjust or like a social credit score sort of system where it's almost deterministic that you're going to perpetuate poverty or you're going to make it impossible for somebody to achieve their chosen profession or like their dreams. Maybe not so much, but as far as making more compatible decisions, yeah, we could certainly find ethical ways to do that.
Very, I agree. I just wonder whether there are certain things, for instance, maybe the algorithm that places me with my job is going to do a better job at finding the right career for me than I would myself. I wonder what happens with my learning experience of applying to the wrong jobs, of working at things that I don't really love, and figuring out the hard things for myself. I think that to me is the place where that makes me wonder is how at what point do you start to begin to erase humanity that shouldn't be erased? And it's a hard question, right? Because if you take it back to medicine, right, it's and make the analogous claim, it would be, oh, so I would be saying that a patient must go through a disease in order to learn something from it if they could be spared by it, right? I don't think it's an easy claim one way or another, but I think that's definitely what is top of my mind is how do we retain our own sense of humanity and humanness in this process? Because I'm very much like you in the sense that I believe in the immense benefits of these tools. I still see them as tools, but I try to keep myself very much aware of at what point am I no longer being me because of this process.
Right. I can see that becoming a problem for sure. That's a nuanced insight. That's something I'll have to think about.
You've given me so much to think about, Logan. I mean, and I'm inspired by your journey. I think I feel humbled. It's beautiful to see someone who's really out there to make their lives about bringing cure and health to others. So I'm very thankful for your selflessness and how you dedicate yourself towards a greater good. And this was a super insightful discussion. I'm very thankful for all of your thoughts and comments. And if our audience wants to learn more about you, what's the best way for people to do that?
Let's see. You could find me on LinkedIn, Logan Nye, Nye, like Bill Nye the Science Guy, or you could add me on Instagram as well. It's Logan Nye. That's about it.
Sounds good. Well, Logan, it's been a huge pleasure. Thank you so much for being here with us at Merging Minds, and look forward to more conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.